After years of suffering, Kansas's tax problems might finally go away, at least in part, after Republicans this week overrode their own party's governor's veto of a tax increasing bill. So basically what happened was years back in like 2014, Brownback comes in, Republican governor, and he decides, you know what? We have these fantasies as a party of massive tax cuts. And you know what? I'm gonna go all in. And so he slashed taxes for individuals, for corporations, massively changing their tax code. And the idea was, the defense at that time was that this is gonna stimulate so much economic activity that you don't even have to worry about the loss of revenue. It is going to fix itself. Now, progressives like us have been telling you, and people have been telling you for decades, that that's not actually how it works. And so they had their experiment in Kansas, and we saw the results. I actually went to Kansas a year or two ago with a union of teachers on the 50th anniversary of the Brown v. Board of Education, because their education system has been devastated by the lost revenue. Their transportation system, road maintenance, all of that devastated because they're not making the money that they used to. Not only are they getting less tax revenue, but there's so many loopholes that many individuals are reclassifying their income as small businesses, and it has been a disaster for Kansas. Credit to the Republicans, at least in some part, they've been trying to fix this now for a few months, trying to pass at least small increases in taxes, repealing some of those tax cuts, but Brownback has stopped them until this week when they were able to get a veto-proof majority. And so now, I mean, we're not talking about a lot of taxes, by the way, we're talking about very small numbers. Individual income would be taxed at rates of 3.1%, 5.25%, and 5.7% starting in tax year 2018. The changes also end Brownback's tax cut for certain business owners, known as the LLC exemption. That is the progenitor of many of the loophole problems that they had.
Yeah, look, I know that those percentages don't seem like much, but they do have a very large impact in terms of raising revenue for the state. So I do want to give state lawmakers, particularly right-wing state lawmakers, a great deal of credit for doing what they're doing, for fighting on this issue, even after the governor vetoed it. I love the fact that they got together and they found a way to override his veto. And essentially, they did the right thing. They realized that it was hurting their state, it was hurting their constituents, and I love that for once, politics were pushed aside, and regardless of political ideology, these lawmakers decided to represent their constituents as opposed to big businesses. With that said, though, there are similar problems in other states, including blue states like California. So in the late 1970s, and this is different because it's not a governor coming in and changing things up, but in the late 1970s, California passed a ballot measure known as Prop 13. And that dramatically cut tax revenue to the state in the form of property taxes. It capped property taxes at, I believe, a little over 1%, 1.5% of the value of a home, right? And so think about it, education is funded through property taxes. And so the LAUSD, for instance, was one of the best school districts in the country. And then after this ballot measure passed, the schools suffered because they lost a bunch of revenue. And the other part of that ballot measure was that in order to increase taxes, you needed a 2/3 majority to vote in favor of increasing taxes, which never happened.
Which is incredibly tough.
Which is incredibly tough. And so California suffers in a similar way, even though the tax cuts were done in a different method or through a different method. And so, anyway, I'm giving you all of that because this is a problem that we're seeing throughout the country. I like that Kansas is taking a step in the right direction.
This is not the tax plan that I would have passed in Kansas, obviously, but this is Kansas after all. So the Republicans are going to have their say. And so, yes, it was the Republican fault that they had this problem in the first place, both the governor and the state legislature, but at least they, to some extent, fixed it. Now, this is consequential not just for Kansas, but for the US as well. If there's any reason in the world, if people are rational at all, it will matter, because this isn't just sort of theoretically like the Republican tax plan, like Trump's tax plan that he wants to enact across the entire country. Many of the people who crafted Brownback's plan are economic advisors for Donald Trump. So they are trying to do to the country what they did to Kansas, what Kansas suffered under for years, and what they had to, under emergency conditions, fix. So we can theoretically get in front of that in the US. We don't need to allow them to pass that tax plan and cut corporate taxes down to 1/3 of what they are now. We don't need to decimate the federal Department of Education, departments of transportation, health, and all of that. We don't need to go down that road. We can learn ahead of time from Kansas's example and make sure that it doesn't happen in the first place. This should be a learning experience, not just for Kansas, but for all of us.
Right, I mean, I feel like, federal policy in regard to taxes should have served as a case study for why cutting taxes doesn't make sense, right? I mean, did it stimulate the economy when we cut taxes for the wealthiest, when we created corporate tax loopholes that essentially allowed the biggest corporations in the country to not pay a single dollar in income taxes? I mean,
I'll have to check.
I mean, we know what the answer is, and so I'm not in agreement with anyone who thinks taxes need to be insanely high for people who earn the most money. But if you're a millionaire or a billionaire, paying your fair share of taxes will still allow you to remain a millionaire or a billionaire. You're going to be fine.
Yeah.
So.
One final thing, Brownback, obviously the bad guy in this, but he's even worse than you might think based on just this issue. So Brownback vetoed a bill that raised more than $1 billion in tax revenue back in February. So that was the prior attempt to fix the situation. And then followed that by striking down the legislature's attempt to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act a few weeks later. Attempts to override the governor's veto on both those bills failed. So again, Medicaid, a program that theoretically helps some of the most vulnerable Kansans. The Republicans tried to do at least something approaching the right thing there, but no, they've got Brownback, and so it didn't actually happen. So,
I mean, and honestly,
too bad for Kansas.
At this point, it's up to the constituents of Kansas to make the right choice when, in future elections. Brownback is not looking out for you. It's very clear.
Yeah.
And so if even the GOP lawmakers in that state are butting heads with him, there's something up.
Membership helps fund the Young Turks. You know one great thing about that? That means we're not accountable to anyone but you guys. That's why we're strong together, because we built this show around you. Come build it even bigger and better at tytnetwork.com/join.